Thank you. Welcome back. We have the privilege today of having, strangely enough, two pastor professors who sort of split the difference. One of whom, Dr. Romero, is also a community organizer. So you're going to hear an academic pair of presentations of sorts, but tied to the streets in a way. Dr. Robert Chow Romero is the Asian Latino professor at UCLA, where he's taught since 2005. Focusing especially on Chicano studies and Asian American studies. He did a PhD at UCLA, so he's kind of come back. He did a JD at UC Berkeley, and he's published over 30 academic books and articles on race, immigration, history, education, and religion. Prolific. He won the Latino Studies Book Award from the International Latin American Studies Association. His latest book, which also really recommend, is called Brown Church, 5 Centuries of Latino Social Justice, Theology, and Identity. He received the InterVarsity Reader's Choice Award that year for the best academic title. He's a former Ford Foundation and UC President's Postdoc Fellow, and as mentioned, is an ordained minister and leading community organizer. He'll be followed by Dr. Ryan Burge, whose star is rising. He is on the talk shows a little more. He's out there a little bit more with sort of tracking the nuns and the religiosity of people on both sides of the aisle. He's a sociologist, political analyst, and an assistant professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University. He focuses on political behavior and institutions and research methods, and he's really particularly animated by sort of religiosity and political behavior in American life. He has published over 20 articles in peer-reviewed contexts, like lots of places, like Politics and Religion Journal, Journal of Scientific Study of Religion, Journal for Religious Leadership, the Journal on Communication and Religion, the Journal of Religion, Media, and Digital Culture. Legit peer-reviewed articles. And he's also the author of a fascinating new book called The Nuns, Where They Came From, Who They Are, and Where They're Going, which details a comprehensive picture of how Americans who have no religious affiliation are finding their way, making their way. His second book, 20 Myths About Religion in American Politics, was released last spring. And we're hoping that this conversation will sort of talk a little bit about some of the things that were raised this morning. Like, if a lot of white and Asian American young men are moving to Silicon Valley and sort of finding their way in different ways, what about the Asian American church? What about the Latino church? Especially if the white church is largely or partially in decline right now in terms of the numbers. Are there sort of bright lights to be seen, to be found, to be discovered in these other communities? Evidently, Dr. Romero has also just done a new book on CRT, so maybe that'll come up at some point. And I'm hoping that Ryan can sort of connect some of those trends with what's going on in American politics. The one thing I'd say is that, like, some of these conferences, they'll sort of think, okay, religion matters insofar as it's about the ballot box. Religion matters when it's voting time. That's kind of what I want to know. Is like, what's the Catholic vote? What's the evangelical vote? So we're hoping that this will be bigger than that, but that Ryan will also help us to connect in thinking ahead a little bit about 2024 to some of those realities as well. Dr. Robert Romero, thank you for.
Give me one of those handouts.
Oh yes.
So I can kind of think.
And you have on your desk a handout as well from Ryan Burge, which I think will hopefully help his presentation remarks. It's grounded in the data. Dr. Robert Romero, welcome to Faith Angle. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Josh. Good afternoon. It's amazing to be here with you all. I want to start with a quote from one of my students at UCLA. So one of the things I've done over the last 10 years is kind of carve out a niche in the study of religion and theology within Chicano Latino studies, which has been kind of a scary thing to do because religion is really kind of just discarded and viewed as only kind of this racist, classist, colonial religion. But I've, over the last 10 years, been charting a path and a conversation. And I've taught a class on the Brown Church and another class on Brown theology at both the undergrad and graduate levels. And one of my students wrote this to me. He said, as a Latino growing up as the son of an undocumented pastor, my experience was much different from those who surrounded me. I felt that I could not identify with my peers, and I always felt out of place. My white peers accepted me in the way that I stood in right by being part of their denomination, but I was not accepted because of my skin color, my race, or my dad's undocumented status. I wanted to believe in what my family and church taught me as truth, but I slowly drifted away from my beliefs as a result of the testimony I received from the Anglo Church and their members. It pains me to say that. Even to this day, those same Protestants refer to us as wetbacks, beaners, and spicks, and there he's referring to a poem that I wrote called The Brown Church. He says, I find myself conflicted with my identity. This student's conflict of cultural and religious identity, it reflects current demographic and sociological trends, which we will discuss, Ryan and I, and also presages the future of Christianity in the United States. What I'm going to focus upon in my talk is the future of spirituality, but specifically with regards to the immigrant church in the United States. As the North American church has diversified through immigration from Latin America, Asia, and Africa in recent years, as you know, a reactionary movement of white Christian nationalism has arisen, which conflates the church with U.S. civil religion and rejects immigrant Christians as undesirable newcomers and even illegitimate believers. One result, as Ryan's going to talk about in great depth, I believe, is that millions of young adults, Latino and others, are fleeing the church, repelled by the increasingly explicit equation of Christianity with white nationalism. Perhaps unsurprisingly, and despite their loud vocal and presence in the popular U.S. imagination, this brand of white nationalistic evangelical Christianity is in sharp numerical decline. At the same time, however, the opposite pole of progressive Euro-American Christianity is likewise experiencing strong downturn. Some elements of this politically progressive expression of Christianity limit faith to social activism while de-emphasizing sometimes personal transformation and deep spiritual encounter with the Holy Spirit. I'm going to use theological language because I'm a Latino Pentecostal pastor, so please excuse me. The fundamentalist modernist debates of a century ago seem to have reached the end of a road as their contemporary denominational progeny do not seem to possess within themselves what is required to successfully address the pressing problems and spiritual hunger of our current day. And a symptom of all this, again, is the flight of the millions of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, right, like my student, from organized religion and church affiliation largely across generational lines. There's a feeling that there must be something more than Christianity as a Sunday morning reiteration of a conservative or progressive political talk show. As in the days of Jesus of Nazareth, however, hope sometimes springs from unexpected and forsaken places such as Galilee of the Gentiles. And the rapidly growing immigrant church, I contend, holds much promise for the future revitalization of Christianity in North America. At the same time that North America is experiencing such an overall marked collapse in formal religious identification, it's also experiencing a diversity explosion, reminiscent of John's vision of the New Jerusalem, of people from every language, tongue, tribe, and nation. The U.S. is in the early stages of a profound racial and ethnic mestizaje, or cultural mixture, in which cultural groups from every continent on the globe are freely mixing in a historically unprecedented way. Just to offer a few stats, I know Ryan's the numbers guy, and he'll do a much better job at this than me, but just to offer a few stats to paint the picture. From 2010 to 2020, the multiracial population of the US, of which I'm a part of, being Chinese and Mexican, it grew nearly 300%. The black population increased from 38.9 million to about 47 million. And the American Indian and Alaska Native population increased, almost doubled from 5.2 million to 9.7 million. And the Hispanic Latino population climbed by 23% to 62.1 million. And the Asian American community, of which I'm also a part, increased to 24 million. The white population still remained the largest race or ethnicity group, but decreased by 8.6%. And in the decades to come, these cultural demographics, these trends will continue to become more and more pronounced. This rapid trend towards cultural diversity is reflected in the changing demographics of the U.S. church. The North American church is browning. It's becoming brown. As white representation is in decline, and all other ethnic groups are together increasing. Immigration from places such as Latin America, Africa, and Asia is fueling this rapid ecclesial change. And in fact, as Christianity Today has written about, 1 in 3 American evangelicals is now a person of color. Accordingly, approximately 1/4 of all Christians in the U.S. come from first-gen immigrant families. And as part of these rapid changes, grassroots expressions of church are gradually replacing the formal structures and practices of Euro-American Christendom. This is the future of Christianity in the United States. These domestic trends coincide with the fact that the global pendulum of Christianity has already swung in the direction of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. The expression that Christianity is a white man's religion is already not true. And by 2050, it's estimated that the majority of Christians in the world will live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with 4 out of every 10 Christians residing in sub-Saharan Africa. The present and future face of the Church of Jesus of Nazareth is brown, and Christianity is returning to its historical origins as a faith of the marginalized, born in the Near East. In the decades to come, Christian immigrants from Latin America, Africa, and Asia will redefine the U.S. church in practice, polity, and theology. Christian immigrants from the majority world bring with them a vibrant personal faith, driven by radical dependence on Jesus, made necessary by suffering and the struggle to survive. There's an abuelita faith, or grandmother's faith, that has been tested and purified by many testimonies of God's faithfulness and passed down to successive generations. Such radical belief is often associated with the rapid global spread of Protestant Pentecostalism, as well as with charismatic Catholic Christianity. But this characteristic of Southern Christianity transcends formal Pentecostal denominational affiliation. We're Baptist-costal, we're Luther-costal, we're Presbycostal, right? If not formally Pentecostal, as in Baptist Pentecostal, Lutheran Pentecostal, etc. Global theologians also bring distinct perspectives that have the potential to address many of the burning spiritual and social questions facing the North American church. Protestant reformers Calvin and Zwingli have good things to say, but little poignance for pressing issues of race and culture. The faith of immigrants will revitalize the U.S. church in many ways unforeseen, and from such faith, revival can certainly spring. Stated another way, Christians from the global South bring distinct community cultural wealth and spiritual capital to the waning U.S. church. The Euro-American church is coming close to the end of its spiritual rope, and I would argue does not possess within itself the cultural resources to save itself. In theological terms, John the Seer refers to this community cultural wealth as the glory and honor of the nations. Revelation 21:26. According to John, every ethnic group of the world possesses distinct glory and honor, or cultural treasure, which is a reflection of the glory of God in and through each of us as God's unique children. Contrary to white Christian nationalist discourse, God does not make shithole countries, and those of every ethnic community possess equal dignity. As an example of this cultural treasure and wealth, I want to talk a little bit about the Brown Church, just a brief introduction. So I defined the Brown Church as the little-known 500-year tradition of Latino Christian social justice. The little-known 500-year Latino Christian social justice tradition, both in Latin America and among U.S. Latinas and Latinos. The Brown Church was born in 1511, about, 6 or 7 years before the Protestant Reformation, when a Dominican priest by the name of Montesinos called all the Spaniards of the Caribbean, of the Dominican Republic together for church one Sunday. And he said, come for this special sermon. He gathered all the Spanish elite of the island and said, listen closely. The voice that you are about to hear will be the strangest you've ever heard. I am one crying out in the wilderness. And then he said, God gave you Spaniards the opportunity to share about Jesus with love, to paraphrase, but instead you've exploited it as an opportunity for selfish gain. And if you don't repent, God's going to send you to hell. That was the first racial justice sermon in the Americas, 1511. He came back Sunday and preached the same thing. There are many other characters and figures of the Brown Church, which I talk about in the book, who have challenged colonialism, patriarchy, slavery, Jim Crow segregation, many, many things, right, in the name of their faith, and yet those stories are really untold. They've been kind of erased. One example is Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez, he once said, the only justice is Christ. The only justice is Christ. And his famous march from Sacramento, or rather from Delano to Sacramento, was actually a religious pilgrimage. I know we talked about pilgrimage earlier. It took place during Lent with the big banner of the Virgin Mary, La Virgen de Guadalupe, and they landed on the steps of the Capitol on Easter morning where they celebrated Mass using a farm worker pickup truck, using an altar made by a farm worker artist. Right? His famous fastings were not hunger strikes, they were spiritual fasts. And many, many other examples I could share. But often the faith of the Latino church, of the Brown church, and Latino social justice movements have been erased. Right? So the Brown church tells that story. I want to just share with that broad overview. Also, like, we've developed theology. We've developed racial justice theology for 500 years. So it's kind of trendy now to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to deconstruct, I'm going to reconstruct, and I'm going to do all that kind of stuff, which is great. I'm glad it's important. But people act as if it's just happening for the first time, right? And we've been doing it for 500 years as the Brown Church. I should also say that by brown, it's a metaphor. Because as Latinas and Latinos, we come in all shades and colors and hair type and eye type. We're, indigenous Latinos, we're European, Spanish, Portuguese, Afro-Latinos, we're Muslim Latinos, we're Jewish Latinos, we're Asian Latinos like me, and every mixture, right? So by brown, it's like a metaphor for that mixture. That's one way I'm using it. And secondly, brown is a metaphor for our, in the United States at least, our racial positioning in between black and white, where we're often left out of the conversation. So I'm grateful to be at the table here, right? Because we're often not part of that. And brown is a metaphor for not just Latinos, but whoever feels in between in the U.S., right? It could be my, Asian American sisters and brothers, my North African sisters and brothers, my South Asians, it's kind of a metaphor for that in between. And from the in-between space, we've also done theology and thought differently, right? And there's this vast community cultural wealth that is present in that theology. I'll just give a couple of quick examples. Latino theologians have honed in on the fact that Jesus was from Galilee. Galilee. They said, well, what is the significance? Like, Jesus was raised in Galilee, chose all his early disciples from Galilee. He, according to Christian tradition, died and rose again and said, meet me in Galilee. What's up with Galilee? And what Latino theologians have said is, Galilee was the hood of Jesus' day. Galilee was the hood. The people in Galilee, they lived far from the centers of power, right, in the big city. They were colonized by the Romans. They spoke multiple languages and had an accent. So if someone from Galilee came, you'd be like, oh, you're from Galilee, right? And what Latino theologians said is, wow, Galilee is East LA today. It's San Antonio. It's Mabton or Clarkston, Washington, right? But Galilee is also the poorest white communities of the South that gets, discarded, or black sisters and brothers from, communities, under-resourced communities, South LA, for example. That's all Galilee, right? And it stands for this principle that says, those that human beings reject, God calls God's very own. There's so much more I can say, but I'll stop with the theology. although again, I can give so many more examples. Maybe in the conversation we can talk about that. But I want to say that these examples are but a small sampling of the distinct cultural treasure and wealth which the Brown Church brings to North America. And if one extends this reflection to consider the vastness of the combined community cultural wealth of the Black Church, immigrant churches from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, it's easy to become quickly overwhelmed and to be filled with a sense of hope. Asians represent the fastest growing immigrant group in the US, and Black immigrants at a size of more than 4 million have increased by 30% in the past decade. Given their critical mass and distinct spiritual practices rooted in vital faith, Asian and Black Christian immigrants will no doubt have a deep impact upon the future of North American Christianity. Their ethnic churches will draw curious onlookers and participants searching for authentic faith beyond a Black-white paradigm. And their second-generation integrated church plants will offer spiritual homes for many cross-cultural families. Characterized by theological orthodoxy, Asian and Black immigrant churches will also swing the doctrinal pendulum in the direction of historic Christian faith. Known for evangelistic zeal, some African and Asian churches may also pioneer models of evangelization among the increasing population of white religious nuns. And in the face of dramatic change, declining white churches and denominations may also turn to immigrant churches for models of revitalization in theology and worship, as well as for future leadership. Notwithstanding these dramatic cultural changes, the structures and theologies of local churches, denominations, seminaries, and Christian colleges and universities largely reflect the church of 50 years ago and another era. Existing ecclesial structures trace their lineages to times of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, white flight. Stated just real simply, they didn't have us in mind. They didn't have us in mind. To be fair also, and I'm just going to close briefly, but the immigrant church also possesses ticking time bombs. There's also ticking time bombs. And if left unchecked, might sabotage the potential for long-term revival. Examples of these time bombs include the prosperity gospel, Christian nationalism, which got sent to Latin America from the US and it's come back. And many immigrants also bring with them belief structures, practices, and financial dependencies, which have yet to be decolonized or untethered from the Euro-American church and its power structures. In sum, fueled by an aging constituency and political division, the days of Euro-American Christianity, I think, are waning. I don't say that with happiness, like it makes me sad, you know. Well, the white nationalist part going away is good, but the Euro-American church, I mean, there's glory and honor there too, that to be recovered, right? Jesus, as proxy for partisan political skirmishes on the right or the left, strays far from the historic Christian message. And the effects are manifest in the downward spiral of white evangelical Christianity, mainline Christianity, and even Euro-American Catholicism. And I will just say that ecclesial hope springs, however, from the diversity explosion which will increasingly define North American church life and society, and Christian immigrants from Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and the Middle East possess thriving faith and vast treasuries of community cultural wealth, which hold promise to revive the Church of North America and address the most divisive cultural and political issues of the future. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Ryan Burge.
You've got a packet here with graphs in it. Josh wouldn't let me do a PowerPoint, so I'm kind of a man who does graphs needs good PowerPoint, so this is going to have to do to substitute for that. This all started. This talk here started with actually an email from Tom Edsel at the New York Times. He emailed me a question. I was actually mowing the grass, and I looked down at my phone, and he asked me. He goes, "Let me ask you something, Ryan. How come Democrats are not mopping the floor with Republicans on Election Day, given the rise of the nuns?" And I was like, wait a minute. That's a great question. Like, I need to think about that for a while. Usually I have like a quick answer. So I took a day or two to respond to him to kind of give him a more thoughtful, nuanced answer of where we are when it comes to religion and politics in America today.
Thank you.
Broadly speaking. So this is largely my answer to that question. The first graph is how did the nuns vote in the last 4 election cycles? We talk a lot about Black Protestants being the most politically cohesive religious group in America today. I don't know if that's true anymore. I actually think atheists are more politically cohesive today than Black Protestants are. 85% of them voted for Joe Biden in 2020, which is the highest percentage ever. The atheists voted for the Democrat. They are incredibly blue. We'll talk about them in a second. Atheists are at a whole different level of politics that would be striking to a lot of people who don't look at the data. Agnostics are, I call them diet atheists. They're just like 10% less atheist on everything. They're 10% more likely to attend church. They're 10% less Democrat. And here they're 8% less likely to vote for Biden in 2020. But notice in 2016, 69% of them voted for Biden, and then 8%. Notice how in 2016, you notice how the third party did really well in 2016. That's a big story of 2016 is the third party's actually shaved off a lot of votes and actually I think hurt Hillary Clinton a lot more than it hurt Donald Trump. 2020, nothing in particulars were 63% for Joe Biden, but look in 2016, they were 55% for Joe Biden. 38% of nothing in particulars voted for Donald Trump. And that's actually a huge group, by the way. We'll talk about that in a second. If you put 5 nuns in a room, one's an atheist, one's an agnostic, and 3 are nothing in particular. They make up almost a quarter of America now is that nothing in particular category. Atheists, agnostics combined are 12%. So, while atheists are an important group from the 85%, agnostics are also important at 78%, really, I think nothing in particulars are maybe the most important religious, right, political group in America today that no one really knows how to talk about. And I've talked to many reporters from many different outlets saying you should write more about nothing in particulars. And the first response is, I go, how do I find one to interview? The answer is, I don't know. They don't have meetings. The atheists there's like 4 atheist organizations in America, national, very well-funded, organized organizations. They've got and what do the nothing in particulars have? Nothing in particular is what they have. They don't join together to do anything, and yet I think they're becoming one of the most important political forces in American life. But you look at these numbers and go, well, but why are the Democrats not just winning everything? Because 85, 78, 63, and the share of Americans who were nuns in 1972 was 5%. Today it's 30%. Amongst Generation Z, it's 45%. So you look at that and go, why in the world are Republicans actually winning anything at all? And it actually gets a lot more complicated than that. So here's the composition of the 2 parties in 2008 versus 2022. The Democrats they're about 45% Protestant and Catholic. So the majority of the Democratic Party is not Protestant or Catholic anymore. That's a big shift, all right? 45% are Protestant or Catholic. It was 57% in 2008, just to show you how fast that change happened, from 57 to 44 in 14 years, 1 point per year for the last 14 years. The other world religions are everything from Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, LDS. Yeah, that's what that category is. It stayed the same, about 7 or 8%. But then look at your nuns here, going from 36% in 2008, and now 48% of the Democratic coalition is non-religious voters.
Sorry, Ryan, how are you distinguishing between, say, agnostic and nothing in particular?
They self-identify that way.
And what is that in your mind?
What nothing in particular means?
Yeah.
They look at all the options and go, nope.
And how is that different from agnostic?
Agnostic is a social category. Like I say, I'm positively identifying as an agnostic. Atheist saying I'm positive, nothing in particular says none of the above. The way we define it is there's 2 different categories of nuns. There's secular people and there's non-religious people. Secular people are atheist agnostic. They have taken the religious worldview and go, I don't want that, and they've replaced it with a secular worldview based on humanism, rational thinking, science, and all these other things. Nothing in particular said, I don't want religion, but I don't want the secular worldview either. So they cast off, they're defined by what they aren't, not by what they are. Does that make any sense? I think they're actually probably the scariest group in America today. because they don't have any sort of scaffolding around them. They don't have any sort of, the atheist community is doing great. I'll talk about that in a minute. I think they're doing very well economically, socially, all those things. Nothing particulars are the least educated religious group in America today. 25% of them have a 4-year college degree. Atheists, it's 51%. 60% of nothing in particular households make less than $50,000 a year. 60%, which means most of them live in poverty. 1/3 of nothing in particulars has a high school diploma or less and makes $50,000 a year as a household or less. 1 in 3 of them. It's 12% of atheists. I mean, that is a very scary combination of factors. And I think they're going to be even more disconnected, disengaged, uninvolved in society going forward. And I think that's really, really bad. As a social scientist and a pastor, I say that. Both are really, really bad for democracy and for society and for their own spiritual health. The Republican Party is still a lot of Christians, guys. Even today, the Republican Party is still, to this day, 73% Protestant or Catholic, okay? Still lots and lots of Christians in the GOP. But look at the nuns. They've risen, okay? 13% in 2008, now up to 21%. 1 in 5 Republicans today are non-religious. So when I say the nuns have touched every part of American society, that's what I mean. Primarily it's on the left, but it's still on the right too. I think there's a very good chance that when Joe Biden runs for re-election in 2024, most of people who will cast a ballot for him will have no religious affiliation. And that'll be the first time in American history where one of the major two-party candidates has gotten half their votes from non-religious people. I mean, when I say the nuns are the largest cultural shift in the last 50 years, I don't think I'm exaggerating. We're seeing a whole change in society that we are only beginning to grasp some of the political, social, cultural implications of that change. Okay, white Christianity, when we talked about this, I feel like this has always been a backdrop of the conversation this morning and then in this afternoon. This is the share of Republicans are in the red who are white and Christian. The overall sample is in the black, and then your independents are purple, and your Democrats are in that blue there. And there's 50%. I marked 50%. You see what's happening in the GSS? It's right about 50% of Americans say are white Christians. Right about 50. Now, other polling firms put it a little bit lower than that. I'm willing to go down to 45 potentially. But still, there's a ton of white Christians in America. And I think and it's very important to diversify the academy and diversify the discussion. You still have to recognize the fact there are still a bunch of white Christians in America. I mean, that's just the reality, okay? That is where we are. And the hard thing about being a social scientist is, I remember sitting my first year of research methods class, we were talking about this book called Suicide by Emile Durkheim. And he went to all these morgues across Paris in the 1800s, and he got the death records of people who killed themselves. And they used to keep really good death records in those days of like what your age, your race, your gender, and your religion were. On your death record, it put it all on there. And so he wrote a whole book about what are the religious determinants of suicide. He found that Catholics commit suicide at lower rates than Protestants. That was his big conclusion. And because Catholics have a more sense of communal religion, Protestantism is more individualized. So we had a whole discussion about this in class. And one of the students goes, I don't like this discussion because it's overlooking the fact that people commit suicide. It's decentering individuals here who take their own lives. And I'll never forget what Professor Scott McClurg said. He goes, listen, here's the thing about what we do. Do we care that Bob committed suicide? Yes. But we're more interested in why people like Bob commit suicide. And that changed how I was as a social scientist. Because I have to realize every person matters, but I have to talk about things in the aggregate, right? Everybody's life is different. Everything I'm talking about here might not apply to you, but it applies to the general trend of what's going on in America. And there's still a ton of white Christians in America. Why do I write about white Christianity? Well, A, because I understand it because I'm a white Christian, but B, because there's still a lot of white Christians in America, and they're still dominating the Republican Party. 75% of the Republican Party today is white Christianity. So even today. Amongst the Democrats, it's only 38%. Okay? So you put those last two pieces together, and here's what you got. You've got a Republican Party who is increasingly relying on a voting bloc that is dying off in massive numbers every day. Okay? White Christians are dying every day in the tens of thousands. So if they're going to even have any electoral success going forward, they got to expand their tent beyond white Christianity. Good luck. The Democratic Party's problem is, how do you hold together a coalition of atheists and black Protestants? They're not on the same page on a lot of social issues. If you look at how black Protestants and Hispanic Catholics feel on issues like transgender and gay marriage and stuff like that, they look a lot like white evangelicals on some of that stuff. So how do you hold together a party of atheists? And so how does the Democrats keep everyone under their tent? How does the Republicans get their tent bigger? That's really the story of American religion and politics going forward, is how those two parties navigate the difficulties of those two things. Next slide, not slide, whatever, piece of paper. People don't realize this when I tell them that white Christianity's not always been this way. In the 1970s, over half of white Christians were Democrats. And this was the reality. If you went to, even up into the late 1980s, if you went to a Protestant church or a Catholic church in America, even predominantly white, you were just as likely to sit next to a Democrat as you were a Republican. So the current situation we're seeing here is actually, this is a unique situation in American history. We've had a lot more political diversity in churches, and now we don't. Now, about 55% of white Christians identify as Republicans, which is, it was 35%, now it's 55%. For Democrats, it was 55%, now down to 30%. Amongst white people who identify as very liberal, 60% say they never attend religious services now. 60%. I mean, it's just become a thing now for white Christians, or white people. If you're religious, you're almost Republican by default. And if you're not, you're almost a Democrat by default. That's how strong the sorting mechanism has become. In my last slide, we'll talk more about how race and religion combine. Okay, so the next one, I found, this is every majority white denomination I could find in my survey. This survey was of 61,000 people, guys. And this is, so there's something called the mainline. You guys heard of this before, the mainline tradition in America? I'm a pastor in the American Baptist Church, which is a mainline tradition. There are 7 of us. ABC USA, Presbyterian Church USA, the Episcopal Church, the Disciples of Christ, United Methodist Church, United Church of Christ, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Those 7 denominations in the 1950s were half of America. Today, they're 10% of America, on the way to 5% of America in the next 10 years, because the average mainline Protestant is now 60 years old. Whenever I talk about white evangelicals, I go, oh, but white people have all these other options for liberal churches, don't they? No, they don't. No, they don't. Because if you look, okay, so you go down the top here, Assemblies of God, 69% Republican. Southern Baptist, 65% Republican. Okay, United Methodist, which is the largest mainline tradition, 55% Republican, 35% Democrat. That doesn't sound like a very liberal church to me, right? You go down the list. You talk about, let's see here, ELCA, evenly divided. PCUSA, evenly divided. ABCUSA, 4% more Democrats than Republicans. Only when you get to the very bottom do you find any majority white denomination that has clearly more Democrats than Republicans, and one is the Episcopal Church, which on an average Sunday in America has 300,000 people in church nationwide, okay? And the United Church of Christ, which total membership now is 800,000. So when I say there is really no options for liberal white Christians in America, this is what I mean. In my county of 40,000 people, Jefferson County, Illinois, today there are 4 mainline churches total. There are 103 evangelical churches, and there are 4 mainline churches. And in the next 10 years, there will probably be 2 or maybe even 1 mainline church in my entire county. If you are a gay couple, you cannot get married in a church in Jefferson County, Illinois right now. There's not a single pastor who would marry you in the entire county. So when I say like there's no white, especially in rural America, there is no liberal or even left of center Protestant tradition in rural America today. So white Christianity has become almost entirely Republican Party. And it didn't used to be that way. It used to be very mixed. And that's not even anything to say what's going on in the United Methodist Church, who has lost almost 20% of its churches in the last 12 months over the issue of conservative versus liberal. And that's going to basically, make the United Methodist Church go downhill even faster than it's going right now, right? Okay, so let's talk about the nuns for a second. The rise of the nuns. This is, like I was telling you guys, look at nothing in particular in the yellow there. 15% of Americans were nothing in particular in 2008. Today, it's almost a quarter of Americans look at all the religious options and go, I don't want any of that. I'm not Protestant, I'm not Catholic, I'm not Jewish, I'm not Muslim, but I'm also not atheist or agnostic. I am nothing. Amongst college-age people, 18 to 22 years old, 1/3 of them say they're nothing in particular, which is the most popular option amongst college students today is nothing in particular. That's their choice when it comes to religion. Not Protestant or Catholic or Jewish or anything else. The share who are atheists, you can see here, it was 6% in 2015, it's 7% today. The atheists are rising very slowly compared to the nothing in particulars, okay? Very slowly. And that's where I think that's the biggest cultural shift in society is that group. Nothing in particular is like we talked about, the lowest education, but then look at the next slide. This is how much they participate in politics, okay? So this, to me, is really the ball game of why I think nothing in particular has bothered me the most politically. So they asked the question, did you engage in any of these political acts in the prior 12 months? And this is in November of 2020. So during the election season, did you do any of these things? Look at atheists. 11% attended a political meeting. It's 5% of nothing in particulars. Put up a political yard sign, which costs nothing, right? They give it to you for free. 27% of atheists did that. 14% of nothing in particulars did that. So half as likely to do even basic political engagement. Work on a campaign, 9% of atheists did that, only 4% of nothing in particulars. Attend a protest or march. 18% of atheists attended a protest or march in 2020. It was only 7% of nothing in particulars. Contacted a public official. 37% of atheists contacted a public official in 2020. It was only 17% of nothing in particulars. You know, these people are the ones who probably need to contact the public official the most because they need help with services and things, and they're not doing it. And then the most striking stat of all is that bottom right one. Half of all atheists in 2020 gave money to a candidate or campaign. Half. You know what it is for white evangelicals in 2020? 26%. 26%. The average atheist is about 60% more politically engaged than the average American. Atheists are the most politically active religious group in America today. Even if you control for education and income, they still are more politically active than the average American. So it's not a story of like rich people with lots of money and time. They're just more politically engaged by any metric. If you look over the last 6 election cycles, every one of them, an atheist is twice as likely to donate to a candidate or campaign compared to a white evangelical. This has been true for 10 years now, and it's not going away. They are wanting to be involved in the political process in ways that other groups are not. I think they're the most politically engaged group in America today, period. And they're 7% of America. I think they punch way above their weight in the discourse because of how engaged they are. For all the boogeyman we make of white evangelicals, I think atheists could be a bigger boogeyman going forward. You know, could have a bigger impact on politics than white evangelicals. If you look in surveys, about 4.5% of Americans are white evangelicals who give to candidate campaigns. It's like 3.2% of the sample is atheists who give to a candidate campaign. So the difference is only 1% of America between donating white evangelicals and donating atheists. It's not as big as you think it is because they're just so darn politically engaged. And I think that's only going to go up as time passes, not down. And I think they're using a lot of social media to kind of energize and engage them. Now, talk about race just really quick. I think this is one of the most startling stats I've seen in the last couple of years is how different religion works for white people versus non-white people. Amongst white people, if you go to church more than once a week, 84% voted for Donald Trump. 84% of people who attend more than once a week voted for Donald Trump. Amongst people who attended every week, 72%. See how it perfectly stair steps down? Like the less you go, the less Republican you are. And it kind of keeps going down. 72, 62, 59, 54. Amongst never attending white people, 64% voted for Joe Biden and 33% voted for Donald Trump. So 2-1, basically. Okay? More and more people are in that bucket, too.
Any type of religion or just
any type, yeah. Yep. So, you know, atheist or Protestant or whatever. Although we are seeing the rise of never attending Catholics and things like that too. So that we can talk about that in a minute. But look amongst non-whites though. Look how little difference religious attendance makes going from never attending to attending more than once a week. Almost none, right? 12 points from top to bottom. So a non-white person who attends church every week, or more than once a week, 67% voted for Biden and 32% voted for Trump. So 2 to 1, okay? But look at amongst never attenders, it's 79% voted for Biden and 18% voted for Trump. So the numbers shift about 10 or 12 points. For white people, the numbers shift 50 points. For non-white people, they shift 10 or 12 points. So when we talk about the story of religion, it's really two stories running on parallel tracks. White religion and non-white religion. You know, I think for white people, what's increasingly happening is religion has become sort of a cultural marker for how you vote more than anything else. For the non-white community, I don't think it works that way. I think it's just, I'm Catholic or I'm Protestant or I'm Muslim or whatever. For white people, it's if I go a lot, it's because I'm a Republican. If I don't go a lot, it's because I'm a Democrat. And that's how kind of clear the sorting has happened amongst white people in America when it comes to religion. Do I have enough time, Josh? I'm good.
Yeah,
man.
you're doing great.
Oh, dude.
And remind us, the non-white category, these big blue bars here,
Yeah.
it's roughly 12% African-American in the country, roughly 19% Latino in the country.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And in a few, like 3 or 4% Asian, depending on the survey, how you ask the question, yeah. But that group's growing, obviously, right? But the question is, how does the Republican Party pivot from the party of white Christian nationalism to, hey, some of you nuns who are a little more conservative, come with us? You know, like, how do you peel off a libertarian atheist, let's say, if you're the Republican Party? And then the Democratic Party has this huge problem when it comes to religion because, you know, there's still a lot of religious people in the Democratic Party. And I think there's something really interesting that kind of went underreported, which was Joe Biden talked a lot about the Equality Act when he was running for president and has talked about it not at all since he became president. Because he realized the Equality Act, you guys understand the Equality Act? It basically makes it illegal to discriminate against anyone based on their gender identity or sexual orientation in any context in America, which polls really well until you tell people that would mean that it would really impede religion's ability to fire people who are doctrinally out of step with what they believe, right? I mean, there's, like, for instance, let's say you're a Catholic school and you have teachers that you hire. Well, let's say one of them comes out as transgender, which is a violation of Catholic doctrine. If the Equality Act passed, at least in the current bill, that Catholic church could not fire that person for being transgender because that's a protected class. Atheists love the Equality Act, obviously. You know who doesn't like the Equality Act? Catholics and Protestants. Because they don't want the government to tell them. So now Joe Biden, if you're Joe Biden, how do you keep this wing, the atheist wing, who's very loud, very donor, very online, who are asking and demanding for these things, equality, 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 with your black Protestants, your Hispanic Catholics, your more liberal Muslims and Buddhists, who don't want the government to tell religion what to do. And I think that's really the primary fight. Is the Democrats can sweep this under the rug for as long as they want, but it's eventually going to bubble up. And the outcry online is going to be so much, they're going to have to do something about this, and they're going to fracture these pieces apart. And I don't know what that looks like in the next 20 or 30 years, especially as the nuns continue to rise. So I'll stop there and let you guys ask questions.
Thank you, Ryan. All right, well, let's flip to you. It's the afternoon hour, so dig deep. It's adult learning, so get yourself some coffee if you need it. Don't feel like you need to wait for that, please. And if you've got a question, let's maybe try the method today. First up is Nina Shapiro.
Question for each of you. So, Robert, I wonder if you talk about the immigrant church. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about immigration issues in the immigrant church. And how mainly Latinos, but not only, view the incredibly heated immigration debate. When I talked with pastors of some very conservative immigrant churches, they have been on board the Trump agenda, for instance. So I know that there is some diversity of opinion. So anyway, I wonder if you could share more about that, and then Ryan, when you look at the stats for how people are voting based on their attendance in church, I wonder if there's a possible, you're saying that people are sorting themselves, but I wonder if there's also a correlation between what's happening in church and how they're voting.
Okay. I'll let you go.
Jump in, sure. So there is no one Latino church. It's more accurate to say there is probably like 1,000. And because Latinos, we come from so many different countries in Latin America. We speak Portuguese, we speak Spanish, we speak indigenous languages, many different socioeconomic backgrounds. So it depends upon which Latino church you're talking about. And I should also say, another really big factor that's not talked about when it comes to immigration and the Latino church, and I'll get more directly to your question, is the role of race. The role of race. So in Latin America, we were joking last night over dinner, like, it's very sad, but we invented racism, right? 100 years before the Pilgrims landed, like, we created the first caste system, right? In Mexico and in the Caribbean. Now, our racial system, it has different names and different people fit into different parts, but there's a very strong sense of race in Latin America where if someone descends from say, more of the kind of European background, they're really going to look down upon, I mean, not in all cases, but in many cases, look down upon people who are indigenous or mixed race or something like that. And so many immigrants, even Christians even, come to the US, bring those racial categories, those racial identities, and then encounter a different race system in the United States, right? And it's for some Latinos, not most, but for some Latinos, it's a quick jump from, oh, I'm Spanish in Latin America to, oh, MAGA. So I think like some of the folks you're talking about, that kind of anti-immigrant, that has something to do with it, kind of the race factor. And the socioeconomic, background too, because if someone is a richer Latino, right, they probably could have waited more years to get the green card versus someone who's like a refugee or someone who had to come under exigent circumstances, right? So I think there's that. So it really depends. Like, are you talking about, Cuban Christians? Are you talking about Mexican Christians, Central American? I think in general, I don't have the numbers to back this up, but I'm sure most Latinos are compassionate towards undocumented immigrants, but a lot of the anti-immigrant Latinos you find are like, they're not necessarily most people. And finally, I'll say, this is gonna be confusing too. Immigration is not on the minds of most Latinos when they go to vote. It's like they want good jobs, they want their family to be safe, they want that kind of stuff. And so I'm an immigration activist, right? That's what I do. I'm a community organizer. I've been arrested multiple times, right? But I know that my voice is not the dominant voice, but we can be one of the louder ones. So it's really complicated.
Yeah, Nina, you're actually, there's been really important shift in how scholars understand religion and politics over the last 10 years. We used to always assume that religion was like the first lens, your contact lens, and then everything sort of lived downstream of that, right? So when the election comes up, you think about what the Bible or the Torah says, and you say, okay, so I'm gonna use my theological lens to figure out who I'm gonna vote for. In the last 10 years or so, the data's gotten better and the methods have gotten better, and we've just changed the way we think about this now. And now we realize that those lenses have reversed, or they might have always been reversed. We just didn't know it until we got better data. And now politics is the first lens, and everything is downstream of politics. So what's happening is people are picking their religion based on their political persuasion, and they're not being, pastors matter a whole lot less than I think a lot of people think they matter. If you look at, for instance, if you take a Republican and look at, let's say immigration, right, which kind of has a moral component to it. If you look at a Republican and you break them out by church attendance, the ones who attend more than once a week have the exact same views on immigration as those who attend never amongst Republicans. Same on gun control. Right? There's these issues that are just, the pastors have. Now on abortion, it does go up, obviously, because there's a component there with all that. But on lots and lots of issues, what we're seeing now is people are picking their church based, if I'm a liberal, I'm not going to go to the Southern Baptist Church down the road. I'm going to try to find a UCC church or UMC church, which will basically pat me on the head. Just as every night when I go to watch cable news, if I'm a hardcore conservative, I'm not turning on Rachel Maddow. Right? We want to have our views confirmed and reaffirmed and all those things. And so what's happened is people pick religion based on their politics. And what that's done, unfortunately, is it's created these enclaves of very liberal, not very many of them, but very liberal churches over here. But then a lot of very evangelical churches, which used to be mixed politically, but now are 80 or 90% Republicans. And more people are being drawn to that in rural America because that's what they are politically, is Republicans. So why not go to the church? Now, let me temper that just real quick. One of the narratives I see a lot in the media is, look at all these political pastors talking about politics from the pulpit. Statistically, that does not happen. We actually ask weekly attenders, we gave them a list of 15 topics. Has your pastor discussed any of these topics over the last 12 months from the pulpit? And they were everything from immigration to healthcare to poverty. I mean, basic stuff, right? Not even highly political stuff. You know what the most popular answer was of those 15? None of the above. 33% of people looked at all 15 issues, goes, nope, my pastor's spoken about none of those. 52% chose 1 or 0 of those 15 issues, okay? Less than 5% of Americans go to church where 10 of those issues were discussed in the last 12 months. Most churches in America are not political from the pulpit. Why? I'm a pastor. You know what it takes to fire a pastor in America? Anything. I have no legal recourse for being fired for being tall or being blonde or being a male or what my kids said yesterday in Sunday school. They could fire me and I have no legal recourse for doing that. And so what do most pastors in America do? You know what they do? Don't offend anybody. Right? Well, and talking about politics, even in a congregation that's 75% Republican, is still going to offend someone because maybe you're not Republican enough, right, on immigration or abortion or whatever it is. So what most of them do is just, they're risk avoiders. And so where do politics come from? I think what's happening in those churches is coming from the bottom up more than the top down. It's the conversation you have in the pew before the church starts and after it ends, or the Sunday school conversation that happens on the Bible study. Or you drive in the parking lot and you see bumper sticker that says MAGA here, Second Amendment there, and go, oh, that's what I am now because those are my people. So I think what's happening is it's not the pastors who are trying to make those churches that way. I think it's generally speaking, it's the people in the pews that are making people more Republican, and you go with where your friends are. So all that to say is I think churches are, it's a reciprocal relationship. They've realized they can probably grow faster if they try to be more generic, but let the population. We did a survey of non-denominational pastors. They talk about politics the least. Because you know what they want to do? Grow. You know what a great way to grow is? Not talk about politics. Michael Jordan was asked one time, why are you not more political? You know what he said? Because Republicans buy sneakers too. That's what non-denominational pastors think. Why would I talk about politics? Because I'm going to divide my total market now goes down by 1/3 or more if I talk about politics. Now, some of them have leaned into that and become hyper-political churches, but I don't think the average church is like that. I think the average church, you know what you talk about on Sunday morning? 3 ways to be a better father, 2 ways to be a better brother, 4 ways to love your neighbor, and go home and feel good about yourself. Because that does not offend anyone, or shouldn't at least.
But you're also suggesting that there's something in the communal atmosphere in church that is influencing people. So it might not be from the pastor,
Yes,
but it could be some alchemy that's happening in the church. And I wonder, is perhaps the rise of megachurches influencing that, where there are big groups of people who all think the same or are pushed to all think the same?
As Josh talked about, Tim Keller used to famously say, I get him for an hour a week. Tucker gets him for 1 hour every night. They're being baptized by the culture every day. I tell pastors all the time, your people are going to be discipled by something. If you don't do it, someone else will. And the problem is a lot of them do exactly what I do, which is I said Black Lives Matter from the pulpit one time. I thought I was going to throw up. It was the most scary moment of my adult life saying Black Lives Matter from the pulpit. I'm a conservative congregation. I get why you would not, you know what I mean? Like, why would you walk up there and get tomatoes thrown at you? It's great to talk in front of people who want to hear what you have to say. It is awful to tell people what they don't want to hear. And so I think pastors sort of fall into the easy trap. We are not prophets. We're caretakers and shepherds. And I think that's and what happens is it leaves a vacuum that something else has to fill. And whether that's Fox News or MSNBC or just what you hear in the local community, that is going to disciple you more on politics than what your pastor has to say. And what your pastor starts talking about, you're probably not going to listen to him anyway. They're probably going to tune you out. So I just don't think pastors have that much power in shaping political culture in America.
Let's go next to Ryan Struck. And we've got Jack Jenkins and Eugene Scott. Oh, there's no wait.
Thank you guys so much for doing this. This is I'm just like eating it up, so thanks. I've got one question for each of you guys too. Robert, you were talking about like the social justice thread in the Brown Church, and I was wondering if you could, there's also a kind of social justice or liberation thread in the American Black church, and I was wondering if you could do a little like compare contrast on that. And then Ryan, I'd love a little bit more of a just detailed kind of analysis of the nothing in particulars. Mm-hmm. Are these people who like have soured on religion? Are they atheists who don't want to use the label? And what do you make of the label and some other polling, spiritual but not religious?
Mm-hmm. So I think I need to sort of clarify brown, what I mean by brown church too. Now, as Latinos, as I've defined us as being in between black and white, we're metaphorically brown, right? And there's always been a few of us that if we get enough money, if we're white passing, we can slip into whiteness, like not perfectly, right? But kind of like Ted Cruz or something, right? So part of the Latino church is like that's one, because like you're persecuted, like you want to like not be persecuted, right? And so historically, what Latinos did is we went to the courts, like during the time of Jim Crow segregation, and we said, Your Honor, you know, this school district can't segregate our kids. He can't segregate us, tell us where to live because we're white. And the judges would be like, and they call in like the anthropologists or something, and they would like have it. And at the end of the day, what's interesting is that like 9 times out of 10, maybe even 10 times out of 10, the judges agreed and said, oh, you are white. And they tell the cities or the school districts, don't segregate them. But we'd go back to Pasadena or wherever, and they would still mistreat us, but just under different pretexts and based upon tradition. So that's a big difference between the black church and the brown church. In fact, many Latinos they don't even like the term brown church. Like they'll get mad at me, right? It's because they want to like be white. And that's complicated. That being said, you have had a tradition in the United States from the time of the US conquest of Mexico under the guise of Manifest Destiny, where we've pushed back. So there was a priest in New Mexico, Father Martinez, and when the Catholic Church came in, the Anglo-Catholic Church came in and destroyed, the Mexican Catholic Church and took out all the culture and art from it and replaced it with European things. Father Martinez, he kind of became a journalist, and he wrote all these op-ed pieces and got expelled, and he was a rogue priest, right? That kind of stuff you have in the time of Jim Crow segregation, because we were not treated very well, by whether a Protestant or Catholic denominations. We had to kind of start our own organizations, our own seminaries and denominations, and I could go on and on and on, right? In terms of, and there's this whole thread. I think one thing that's probably different from the black church, in my understanding at least, is that the brown church, the social justice thread has been equally Catholic and equally Protestant. That's probably a big difference. And again, there's always been some of us who it's easy to sell out because it's like sometimes you can. So I would say those would be some of the differences. And I would finally say most Latinos have never even heard about the brown church. But that would be a further discussion.
Yeah, so nothing in particulars. I think they're the most anti-institutional people in America today. They reject every layer of institution. That's why when you see they only have 25% of them have a college degree, I think the majority of them tried and dropped out. Or they tried to apply and couldn't get in. They couldn't get over the social aspect of education. And institutions don't work for them there. They don't engage in the political process. Why? Because politicians don't pay attention to guys like me, right? Who I think they are in my head? I picture the person who I went to high school with, who graduated at 18 and wanted to go work in the same factory his father did, and that factory doesn't exist anymore. Or if it does, it pays half as much as it did 30 years ago, and you can't live the same quality of life that your parents did, but you really don't want to go get a college degree, and you don't really have a whole lot of options. They're the ones who are left out, left behind, and lost. They're drifting in social, political, and cultural space. The spiritual but not religious category, I think, somewhat encapsulates them, but not perfectly. So for instance, 34% of nothing in particular say religion is somewhat or very important to them. So they're not like anti-religion, right? Amongst atheist agnostics, it's less than 5%, right? So they're more religious than atheist agnostics. They're less religious than every religious group, obviously, but they're more religious than atheist or agnostics. About 15% of them go to church at least once a year. So there's some, like, you know what I mean, like little like indications of maybe they're not like so turned off by religion as your atheist agnostics are. But I mean, I think these are the kind of people. There's a great podcast the New York Times did called Rabbit Hole, and they had a kid on there who I swear, he never said it, but I swear he's done nothing in particular. He lived in Iowa, went to college, after second year got kicked out for drinking in the dorms, came home, lived with his parents, and managed a Dairy Queen. And they asked him, what do you do all day when you're not managing the Dairy Queen? You know what he said? Watch YouTube. I watch YouTube 8 to 10 hours a day. And the whole thing was about how the algorithm, Trey's not here, the algorithm can make you into something that you're not. And he got stuck in, you guys know who Stefan Molyneux is? He's a terrible racist, xenophobic, misogynistic human being. Actually got kicked off YouTube after a period of time. But this guy in the podcast got discipled by Stefan Molyneux and became a hardcore right-wing racist xenophobe. And you know what happened 12 months later? He became a Bernie bro because he got sucked into left-wing YouTube. That's what I worry about, right? Like the thing about you being an atheist is they have a moral compass. They really do. Although there is a whole new atheism, racism strain that's going around that's kind of difficult, but usually they're very inclusive, very tolerant. And in Christian communities and religious communities, you have a pastor that comes in and says, we don't believe that here. You know what I mean? Like that's out of bounds. What happens if you have a group of people who have no out of bounds? Mm-hmm. They don't have any scaffolding around them that says like, these are acceptable and these are unacceptable. That's going to pull you in some really scary directions. And I obviously statistically you can't do this, but I wonder if a lot of those people who engage in a lot of heinous acts are nothing in particular when it comes to religion because they really don't have anyone in their lives to say, you know what, you probably should stop watching that idiot, right? What's that, Andrew Tate? You guys know who Andrew Tate is? My son goes, I love Andrew Tate. I go, son, you will never watch Andrew Tate ever again. He's an awful human being who hates women. And I banned him from watching it. But you know what? The algorithm told him how great Andrew Tate was. He needed me in his life to say, no, he's not. And I wonder if there's not enough people, those people, nothing in particular, don't have someone in their life to go, you will not watch that. You will not listen to that. You will not believe that here because that's unacceptable in polite society. And that's what makes this group very scary for me as a pastor and as a social scientist because and when people are disengaged from democracy, that's when bad things happen. That's when we storm the Capitol. That's when we set up protests and violent protests because it's like my voice can't be heard and that group is growing. And I think they're a very, very scary group. And we need to think better about how to reintegrate them into society in meaningful ways. Maybe not religion, whatever, but get them into a social group, right? Mm-hmm. And I tell pastors, I go, listen, here's what you need to do. Take 10% of your budget set aside for social activities only. No religion at all, just social stuff. Carnivals, barbecues, July 4th, you name it. Get those people on your property to just hang out with other people with no ulterior motive, no evangelism, no contact cards, no growth, none of that. Just to hang out, and you will be better for it, and your community will be better for it, and democracy will be better for it because those people need social ties, and they don't have them right now. So.
It's obvious that Ryan loves numbers and demography and metrics, but he's a little bit of a preacher. It's just great.
Wait a minute.
All right, Jack Jenkins, who wrote the book American Prophets at Arnes.
So a quick question for both of y'all. Robert, you kind of mentioned the how Christian nationalism was exported and brought back in these communities, and I'm just curious about what the dialogue about that is at this point, the status report, just because I know it's a targeted group by certain parties in this country as well. They're looking to flip states, trying to use that phenomenon. So I'm just curious, what the dialogue around that is like. And then Ryan, you might not be able to answer this, but I am just curious, when I look at these graphs, for so long, partisan identity has been king. It's defined so much about what we do with our lives. But we also exist in a really weird political moment where what it means to be a Republican, right? There's some stratification across that board about who you would vote for, or what you would support, or whether you would show up to vote on election day. And you were talking about pastors earlier. Now there's I just wrote a story about how Turning Point USA is actively trying to recruit pastors to be political. They just had a conference with like over 1,000 pastors or 1,100 people, 80% of whom were pastors on that topic. And I'm curious if we have any sort of like look at what it means within these parties, like some different when people are party IDing within these the stats we're seeing here, whether nothing in particulars or what have you. Do we have some sort of I'm curious if they fit along that constantly evolving sliding scale within the Democratic Party, particularly the Republican Party right now as well, and if there's any sort of if their faith informs any of that, where they sit on that scale.
So I'm not an expert in this topic, but just to give a couple of thoughts. So I'm thinking of like Bolsonaro in Brazil, right, and some folks in Peru who have sort of watch the Trump playbook and then try to copy it. I know that, as an example, in Brazil, there is a strong tie between the nationalism and certain religious denominations. I'm not going to embarrass them. And so when immigrants come to the U.S., I think it's like certain immigrants, right? It's easy to get kind of tied into MAGA, right? Because especially like if you're connected, again, to the same political evangelical network, that's not most Latinos by any means, but it's a good number, right? So that's kind of a scary thing. So I think it's people get connected to the nationalism through the politics. I think what draws some people, I don't think that they're drawn to the nationalism because they say, I love nationalism. I don't think it's like that. I think that in a lot of cases, it's like, let's say someone came from Venezuela or they came from Cuba, like they came from socialist countries. They're really scared away by some of the democratic kind of ideological discourse. Like once I remember I was at a conference, I was talking to a Cuban taxi driver, and he said in Spanish, I'd rather have them assassinate me than send me back, right? And so I think that pushes them to the Republican Party, and then it's easy to then just fall into this whole pattern of thought. That would be my best shot at it.
First, Jack wrote a great piece about Turning Point's really trying to lean hard into making Republican churches a thing, which I think is actually really smart because you're micro-targeting, right? You're saying listen, those 80% of people, we don't care about them. We're gonna go deep into 20% who are hardcore Republicans and get them in church. Non-attending, strong Republicans need to come here. That's a strategy, not a strategy in a small town, a strategy in a metropolitan area where you've got a big total addressable market. Small towns, you got to be as broad as you can be because you can't turn anybody off. So the question I think Jack's asking is do words mean the same today as they meant 30 years ago or 40 years ago? God, that's such a great question. So the one thing that I keep looking at to make sure that I've not gone crazy on that is if you look at a big national survey that's been going on for 50 years, the General Social Survey, has been going on since 1972. The mean American, so if you track mean partisanship over the last 50 years, it's always in the exact same spot. And I look at that and go, okay, we've somehow figured out what a Republican is, and it might have changed, but the share of Americans who are that has gone the same over the last 50 years. And that makes me go, okay, all the pieces move, but the American public, God love us, we can find middle. And we found middle for the last 50 years. So even if these two labels move this way and that way, somehow the average American still is smack in the middle of, not just that, by the way, the liberal conservative scale, right in the middle of that, and the Republican Democrat scale, right in the middle of that. And that's what, with polling, sometimes you have to have a sanity check. This is all made up, right? It's just all gobbledygook. And you look at that and go, it cannot be made up. It's too, it's too consistent. And there's this thing in economics called the wisdom of crowds. You guys ever heard of this before? If you ask people, guess how much a cow weighs, you'll get some crazy answers both ways. But if you average all the responses together, they're almost always really close to the actual weight of the cow. And I feel that is what surveys do, is figure out how much a cow weighs. And the ones who do really good at that, even if the words change, we still find middle. And that kind of gives me a lot of hope that what I'm doing with all these graphs is not just black magic or something like that. I'm actually doing something valuable. So,
Yusra Farzan from the Orange County Register.
Thank you so much for this discussion. Really fascinating. I have a question for both of you, very different questions. For Robert, I wanted to ask you how the Asian American community sort of fits into the concept of brown church. I cover a lot of Asian American communities for the Register in Monterey Park. Went to a couple of the churches after the shooting. I also cover the Vietnamese American community, which I think is sort of assimilated into white churches, at least in Orange County. So really curious to see how you've sort of noticed the Asian American community plays within the brown church. And for you, Ryan, I wanted to ask these numbers and how people are voting. What are some of the issues that they care about, right? Like we were discussing this at dinner yesterday, at least in some parts of the country. I know a lot of conservative Muslims now are sort of aligning with Christian evangelicals because of certain issues. So I wanted to ask if, the numbers that you have for white Christians who vote Republican, is it issue driven or do they just identify with the party because that's how they've historically voted?
In terms of put my Asian American hat on for a moment, when I give a talk on brown church to like churches and stuff, there will be definitely my South Asian brothers and sisters will be like, I'm brown church. I'm like, awesome, come right. My Filipino sisters and brothers too, because I'm Chinese and Mexican, which means I'm basically Filipino. And we're just we totally totally connect. I think that just anecdotally, when my East Asian friends, say even fellow Chinese Christians, the brown metaphor doesn't really kind of connect that much. I think the Asian American church, there's a lot of, but that being said, there's a very strong strand of Asian American justice theology. It's like a moment now. So there's Daniel Lee just came out with this amazing book about Asian American theology, Daniel Lee. And so there is a strand, I guess, to say, they wouldn't necessarily call themselves brown church, but this Asian American Christian theological justice strand, and even fewer people have heard about that. And then in the older generation, again, speaking anecdotally, the older generation is super conservative and like my mom or something. Love my mom, she's amazing, but her generation, they tend to be more shaped by traditional evangelicalism, and so they will not watch MSNBC or something, right? They will not, that kind of thing. So I think there's a big diversity.
Yeah, so when we talk about, what issues motivate people, Trump gave it away, didn't he? A week ago, he goes, I can talk about tax cuts all day, but I talk about transgender, everyone's like, yeah! That's the thing. If you look at polling, it doesn't work that way. If you ask people how important are the following issues to you, polling from 2016 amongst evangelicals are 15 issues. Gay marriage ranked 15th out of 15 in 2016. Literally, and by a long shot too, by the way. Not just a little bit, they just don't. And abortion, depending on age, ranked from somewhere between 9th and 11th out of 15 issues. You know what the top ones were? Taxes, defense, corruption, Social Security. Bread and butter Republican issues is what they say they care about. It's there's this huge disconnect between what you see, anecdotally, and then what the polling data tells you. I have the stupidest job in the world. My job is to figure out what goes through someone's mind when they hit the button on election day. How stupid a job is that? Because some people vote because they don't like Donald Trump's hair, and then some people, vote for someone else because of some minute piece of policy way down in the tax code that they said Biden would vote to repeal. You know what I mean? A very nuanced decision here and a guttural, emotional decision over here, and they both vote, and they both count the same. I think what the reality is Liliana Mason wrote a great book called Civil Disagreement. She said that partisanship is the master identity, and everything falls, is basically falls in line past that. And so all those issues is well, what does my party think about this? Therefore, I will think about this too. You know what I mean? We call it a heuristic, which is a shortcut, which is I don't have an opinion about something until Tucker or Rachel tell me how to feel about this new thing that pops up. Right? If you look at the polling data on how we felt about China 15 years ago, we're meh, China. Now it's partisanship. because the parties have to tell us how to feel about those issues. We are not naturally inclined to care about them. So really, the most important thing is are you Republican or are you Democrat? That will tell me how you feel about trans and taxes and everything else in the world, because that's really all that matters now is your partisanship, which sucks, because it reduces people to one-dimensional people. It also reduces what we're talking about now. Religion has become a foible for politics. When religion should not be that. It just unfortunately has become a cultural marker for politics now. And that's really, really unfortunate, I think, for politics and religion and society. But that's the world we live in, and we all kind of chase our own thing. I know if I write certain kind of stories, I'll get more clicks. So you better believe subconsciously I want to write stories that get more clicks. And they happen to be about politics and religion, especially how bad white evangelicals are. So that kind of incentivizes me to continue to do that and continue this one-dimensional discussion of religion and politics. But that's what we're stuck with. So,
Just related to that real quick.
Please.
My colleague, Soon Chong Ra from Fuller, he talks about how the label evangelical, 50 years ago, it was more of a theological kind of meaning. It was if someone would say, I'm evangelical. Oh yeah, you believe this and this and this, and these are your convictions about who Jesus was and the Bible. Now you can get 50 evangelicals in a room, and they can have all completely different theology. Because like you said, it's a political marker. So it's gone from sort of a theological sort of identity to just a political marker.
So I wrote an op-ed for the Times, New York Times, with that whole idea. The share of people who self-identify as evangelical is 33% today, same as it was 15 years ago. But the share who never or seldom attend church was 16% in 2008. It's 27% today. We're seeing the rise of, this is self-identified evangelicals, right? We ask you a yes or no question. Do you consider yourself born again or evangelical or not? We ask it to everybody. And you say you're atheist, we still ask you. And what we're seeing is the rise of evangelical Muslims, evangelical Jews, evangelical Catholics. And you know what it always is? It's Republicans. Republican Muslims are much more likely to be an evangelical compared to a Democrat Muslim because they see the word evangelical as meaning a political thing, not a theological thing. And I think that's something really important, that we don't own words. You guys as reporters don't own words. We talk about what a Republican means, right? What does that word mean? No one knows, And whenever someone says, and this is how I approach all my survey stuff, when someone says they're an evangelical, it's not my job to go, no, you're not. Right? I'm not engaged in boundary maintenance to say, oh no, this is what evangelicalism means. No. My job is to figure out why you said yes. Maybe you just were going real fast and hit the wrong button, but the data says that's not what's happening. There's something very important culturally going on, which is that Republicans are gravitating to the word evangelical because they like what it means as a social and cultural marker, a tribal marker in the 21st century. And it's going to continue to go that way. And you know who really hates that? Southern Baptists. They hate that because they're saying, no, that's our word. They're not a real evangelical. I'm like, well, who's to say you're a real evangelical? Maybe they're the real evangelicals. And that's the problem, is that no one owns words. So that makes it hard and beautiful and terrible to be a survey researcher, because we have to rely on people to check boxes correctly and figure out why.
Let's take one last question and then we'll take a break. Eugene Scott from Axios.
I have two brief comments and then my question. But as a journalist, I also hate that people don't own words, because I need words to actually mean.
Yes.
But it's been really difficult writing about our society, considering that words don't always mean the same things to the same people. During the 2018 and 2020 elections I covered, I wrote about race, faith, and politics for the Washington Post, the intersection of them. And a point that you made, Robert, that I think is so important is about just how generational various Latino communities and Asian American communities are engaging politics, because we are seeing that part of what older immigrants from these communities believe being American is often means not being critical and not questioning in ways that liberals do. And so it does tend to come off as more nationalistic in their view of the country, and therefore Republican. And we have there's a great researcher and professor Shadi Hamid, who's a friend of Faith Engel, and he's a Muslim and from an immigrant family, and he made so much sense when he explained it. He's like, if my parents thought America was so terrible, why would they be working so hard to come here, right? And so you don't try to work hard to come to America and then just like criticize it repeatedly. And who's criticizing it? The left. The right is not. They love it. It's awesome. And so that's why so many immigrants, Latino, Asian, Muslim, and others are, it's easy for the Republicans to like sweep them up. And so that point I thought you made was very important, because that's not what we're seeing in Gen Z, Asian Americans and Latinos. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few elections. Briefly, Ryan, your point about how many pastors, surveys saying how few pastors actually talk about politics from the pulpit. And it's not that is a meaningless stat, but any of us who've been a part of churches know that pastors are not the only influencers in a church.
That's right. Yep.
So it doesn't matter if and many, and I'm not being cynical here, I think many pastors are smart enough to know that they don't say stuff at 11 o'clock or whatever time your service starts. When the small group leader or the Bible study or the BBS or whoever can get the point across. And so it's not like people are taking these surveys like, I don't know where my church stands on these issues. They know because it's being said very clearly. And last, my actual question, I'm most fascinated by the nothing in particulars because for disclosure, I'm agnostic, and I have lots of, friends who are agnostic and atheists, and all of us are former like PKs and all this kind of thing. And I don't understand the nothings in particulars, in part because, and when you shared how like they're not that educated and they're less affluent, like all of that's news to me. But, and my thought before has been, you are something, you just aren't admitting what you are. And I don't know how true that is. I'm not a surveyor. That's just my own bias and trauma coming up. But what I do think might be true, and I don't know if this is the point, I don't know if the research speaks to this, they may not know what they are because some of these people don't think about faith as much as some of us who have made a choice, think about faith, right? Like I think a lot of times when you're in a religious community and you're just thinking about faith so much, but that's not everybody's story. And sometimes when I have brought up faith in conversation with people, you can tell that it's the first time they've thought about faith in a while, whereas many of us who think about faith in politics professionally or personally think about it all the time. So I wonder if some of these nothing in particulars, if they really wrestled with it, they'd be like, you know what, I actually am agnostic. But I don't know what you found in your research.
That's a great, so thanks for teeing me up. I appreciate that, because I just found out last week that I got a $350,000 Templeton grant for a project called Making Meaning in a Post-Religious America. We're going to do the largest survey ever of non-religious Americans. We're going to spend $100,000 on this survey to survey 20,000 of them. And part of that's going to be to try to get to a better typology than the current typology, right? I think this atheist, agnostic, nothing actually comes from Pew, by the way. Yeah. They're the ones who started this. And I think they would even tell you that like it doesn't work. Like it doesn't, it's not operationally that good. And I think there are subgroups inside the nothing in particulars who are of what you just talked about, where some are like, I don't care about religion. And some are like, man, I'm struggling spiritually, emotionally, relationally, and I don't know why. And then some are actively rejecting all institutions because of trauma and bad experiences and all those things. I think I tell my students all the time, the problem with being a political scientist is you think everyone thinks like you do. Like as a journalist, you think everyone knows everything that you know. And that's the problem that I think a lot of us have when it comes to religion. I think about religion literally 12, 14 hours a day, every day. And some people think about it never. And how do I can't put my brain in their thinking because my brain could not go that direction because I'm just so, even if I wasn't doing this work, I would still be thinking about it all the time. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a person? What about salvation and forgiveness? All that kind of stuff. But some people I found in my life just are, like how Pascal says everyone has a God-shaped hole. I want to find out what percentage of Americans don't have a God-shaped hole. You know what I mean? Who just don't care one way or the other. And they're cool with that. Yeah. Like it does not make their life better or worse to not be religious or to be religious. And I think that's the problem is we think religion's for everybody. I will say this though, the General Social Survey just came out. It's been asking a question, what do you believe about God? Even in 2022, the year of our Lord, 2022, 85% of Americans still believe in God at some level. Only about 6 or 7% say they're atheists, and about 6 or 7% say they're agnostic. So even with 40% of Americans never attending, and the nuns are 30%, still only 15% of Americans say God doesn't exist, or we cannot know if God exists or not. So we are still a very believing country compared to Western Europe. So I need to figure that's the part of the grant is to try to figure out what in the world those people actually look like. So.
Great. It's 2:34. Let's resume if we can at 2:45. So take a 10-minute break. One more push. All right. Well, first up, if it works to start us off, is Lauren Gustus from the Salt Lake Tribune.
Thanks. Okay. Ryan, I have a very quick question for you.
Yeah.
I think. I'm interested in how specific the data you have here is, i.e. is it available at the state level, or are we talking just national?
Interesting. Okay, so can I talk? Let me take a quick step back. So for a long time, from 1972 until about 2008, the biggest data set we have would have 3,000 people in it total. And then from 2000, I tell all these young grads, and you don't know how good you have it right now. I wrote a piece for RNS called "We're in the Golden Age of Religion Survey Data." So now, the 2020 cooperative election, they had 61,000 people in it. And there is, in the bigger states, you might have 500 or 600 people from Texas or California or something like that. So you can definitely do state level analysis of, you can't do Rhode Island or Montana, because they're just not. What I typically do then is I'll take 3 or 4 years and mash them together and then do it that way, because the theory is religion doesn't really change that much over a 2-year period of time. It's over a 10-year period of time. The other great data source is called the Religion Census, which does county level religion. They actually contact every religious tradition in America and say, can you give us data on where your congregations are and how many people are on your membership rolls of each of those congregations? So you can actually get as fine-grained as looking at the county level at religion. I wrote a piece for Politico where I actually used that data to paint this interesting picture of why did Miami-Dade County become a lot redder over the last 10 years? And one reason is because the share of people who are part of a congregation in Miami-Dade County went up 12% between 2010 and 2020. And Bucks County, Pennsylvania went blue, 18% less religious today than in 2010. If you look at the Rio Grande Valley, Star, Maverick County down there on the border, there's Maverick County was 33% attached to a house of worship in 2010. It's 73% today. So you're seeing all these weird little things, and you can write, there's so many stories you can write based on that county level religion census data. Now, is it perfect? No, but I always say, well, what's the alternative? This is as good as it gets. They have an entire body of people who collect this data. So and it's publicly available. You can go download it right now. It's in Excel, so it's not even that hard to manipulate and figure out what county you're looking for. And I would say that's a great source to look at, county level.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Robert, I'd like to get a little bit more insight with respect to, I think you mentioned quickly some time bombs at the end of your discussion, the prosperity gospel, Christian nationalism, and financial dependencies, if I got it right. Mm-hmm. Would you speak a little bit more to those concerns and if possible, help us contextualize which ones we might look at more so than others?
That's a great question and comment. So I think with respect to the financial ties, a lot of Protestant churches at least began through missionary efforts in Latin America. So someone from a particular denomination, say Baptist or Presbyterian, 100 years ago or 70 years ago went to Latin America, and people heard a certain Christian message and had their lives changed. It wasn't all bad, it wasn't all bad. And then they, in turn, some become pastors. They're like, okay, I want to start a church. Well, where do I get the money from? Oh, well, the American Baptists are going to give their mission fund. They're going to fund us. And then where some of the tension happens is where second-gen pastors or even pastors themselves are like, I want to start thinking about theology from our own cultural lens. And then the missions orgs would be like, no, right? we trust you to start a church, but leave the theology to us, right? And so some folks so there are those who are pressing into that issue and developing unique theologies, and still that's grounded in kind of the same, Christian basis, but, developing unique views on poverty and immigration and things like that. So there's some rub there. But some people will not adapt to their cultural context because they don't want to lose the money. Okay? Or if someone in the US, like let's say, they have a church in LA, but they like the grants, right? So they're going to support some, political causes that ultimately hurt some of their own congregation members, right? Especially with respect to immigration, like that was very common, right? That's where Latinos, we can get pulled into U.S. civil religion. That happened during the Trump era, right? Like some Latino pastors going to, like after all the, the terrible things about kids in cages and stuff, Trump sent a group of evangelical pastors, including some Latino pastors, and some of those Latino pastors came back and said, "Oh, it's great. There's nothing wrong. The facilities were awesome." Like, so that's big. That's a big danger. So in terms of like a lot of that with those financial political ties. And then I'll just say one more thing. You have the same seeds. Well, I'll put it this way. I think what's allowing the Latino church to thrive is that people's lives are changed. Truly, right? Like on an individual level, like there's like healings. I don't want to freak you out, but there's like people get healed and people's lives are changed and they stop being, substance abuse gets broken, really radical, drastic things. That's what's fueling the growth. But there's, in my view, like this cancer that's there. It's in a small form right now, relating to the nationalism and all that kind of stuff. And just like that nationalism is taking down the white church, if they don't change, if the Latino church doesn't address those issues, it's going to get taken out eventually as well.
And you mentioned the other day that post-COVID, like someone said this morning, many religious communities didn't fully come back, but the Latino community was different.
Oh yeah, so that's a good kind of point to talk about the narrative, right? So a lot of the narrative, at least as I'm familiar with, around religion is white church is tanking, people aren't going to church, and so on and so forth. But the Latino church is growing and thriving, right? So there was an article I saw in the Post, and it said, oh, with the downturn of white churches and denominations, what's going to happen to the social safety net, right? And that around the same time, I was charged with doing some research on the Latino social safety net in churches. So I worked with an organization called Urban Strategies, and they had already conducted all these interviews of like a whole bunch of churches during COVID, and I kind of crunched the data with one of my grad students. And what we found was that, like, oh my gosh, like almost 100% of the churches that we surveyed were engaged in social services and social safety net kind of stuff during COVID. And whereas like volunteerism declined during COVID amongst other churches, it actually went up in the Latino church, right? And a lot of these churches, like, they didn't have large budgets, but they'd spent upwards of like 60% of their budget, 70%. There was one church that spent like 90% of their budget on social engagement. So just a kind of a issue of narrative, right? And as a Latino church, unfortunately, we kind of get left out of the narrative.
Sophia Lee from Christianity Today, or at least you did have a question. You want? No? You're happy. Please hit that button too, if you wouldn't mind, from Will.
This is for Dr. Chad Romero. I'm curious when you talked about the face of the U.S. church kind of changing, with 1/3 becoming POC, and then lots of immigrants coming in, and that you mentioned like a future revival, like how that's going to impact the U.S. church. I'm asking because like I personally am a little dubious, because I heard that narrative and I love it. I want it to be true, but at the same time, the second and third generation, what happens to the second and third generation immigrants? Because when I I live in Los Angeles as well. I used to live in Pico Union district, and there are a lot of like Latino Pentecostal small churches in just the neighborhoods, and I would hear them singing praise songs like Wednesday, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays. But when I drop in, I actually visited one before, but like I don't see a lot of people my age. I see a lot of people who are first generation immigrants, and then they're young children, but then the young adults who are the second generation or 1.5 generation or third generation. I don't really see them in those churches. I myself used to go to a Korean immigrant church for a bit in Los Angeles, but there was such a great division between the first and second generation that I had to leave. And now I'm going to a pretty white church. And I know a lot of people who have grown up in those immigrant churches who either left the faith or they would go to a white church because now I don't know. So like I'm curious, like when you say like a spiritual, like a revival, and then how the diversity of religious people as the demographics is different. Like, can you give me some details of what kind of revival you are seeing or you envision happening?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I grew up in one of those Latino immigrant churches, and then nobody in my generation is there anymore. So I think so there's, I guess, first these issues of like generational, what happens with the generations, right? I think that's one of the ticking time bombs that I'm talking about. I think that it's just as a matter of sheer numbers, right? And there's many different types of Latino churches, right? Different immigrants, different groups. I think that they're thriving, right? There are, of course, churches and there's lots of churches where they're second gen. I mean, so it's like, I think but that's definitely the rub, right? But that being said, actually, let me give an example of what I mean, like an actual example of like what I'm talking about with immigrant churches and stuff. So in Boston, right? There were only several decades ago, only about 300 churches, right? Everyone talks about, oh, Boston's so post-religious and stuff. Now there's 600 churches. But those churches are Brazilian and Korean and African, right? So that's all happening. I think with respect to and there's some very loud second-gen people that are leaving the church, and some for very good reasons, right? But when I work with Latino young adults, like many of them are staying too. So I think it's a complicated narrative, you know. So but I think nonetheless there's a ticking time bomb, and the ticking time bomb is sort of, again, it also relates to what happens when we become Americans, right? And then how do our ecclesial spaces adapt to incorporate that and language? I go to a church called La Fuente Ministries in Pasadena, and it's an example of, you know, what's possible. And a lot of people it's not a big church, right? Because it calls people to a pretty high commitment level of both justice and personal transformation. And during like George Floyd and that era and all the Trump stuff, it was a community organizing hub, right? And so like dozens of people, churches from different immigrant churches, Latino churches would come to stop unjust deportations. There was a big national case involving Pastor Noé Carillas, for example. He was an Assemblies of God pastor who came to the U.S. as a child refugee because he was kidnapped by guerrillas in Central America. He came to the U.S. undocumented. He married a U.S. citizen wife. He has 2 U.S. citizen kids. He's a pastor in the Assemblies of God. He has a construction business. And during the Trump era, he was about to be deported, right? It was terrible. And our organization, Matthew 25, along with others, we were able to bring together dozens of churches throughout LA. Churches that they would never call themselves activists, right? And we organized like prayer chains from here to Chile, right? And there are people all throughout the country. You know, we did like a whole week-long prayer service in front of ICE. Because we knew that the head of ICE was like a faithful Roman Catholic, we wrote him like notes with like Catholic social teachings and like Bible verses. And of course, we called all our congressmen and stuff like that. Someone even contacted Trump. And the miracle of it all was he was released. I'll never forget the day. We have it captured on video, right? And we'd have Friday night prayer services and all this stuff. My point being, like, it's something new. That it created something new. And that something new has the potential to really address a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, a new way of being church.
Eleanor Klobanoff from the Texas Tribune.
Thank you. Yeah, I have some like additional demographics questions, but nothing in particulars, which is, we can all agree, like super fascinating. And you mentioned sort of this one group that's like sort of the like disaffected people, you know, without college education, sort of maybe at risk of being sort of cut off. I feel like a common story I hear from like my peers, I mean, sort of like the work as religion that we heard this morning, and the idea of like a lot of people who feel like they'll figure it out when they have kids, maybe, you know, like when it comes time to like pass something else on. Yeah. And, you know, we have falling birth rates where people are not getting married, they're not having kids as much. Do we know anything about sort of what role that plays and sort of what that other group is? Like people who are not, you know, people who are college educated, who are just sort of choosing to not engage with either religion or, you know, atheism and agnosticism?
Yeah, so they typically are, you know, education, we talked about it, you know, most of them don't have a college, 75% don't have a college degree, right, which is insane. And you know, considering the national average is 36% now, so they're way below that. When it comes to marriage and family, they're much less likely to be married. And when they marry, they tend to marry later. The kids thing really depends on a couple of factors, right? Can I give you an interesting statistic that kind of riffs on that for a second? The question in the survey is, are you the parent or guardian of any child under the age of 18? 40-year-old atheists, you know what percentage of them say yes to that question? 40%. So we can probably infer from that data that most atheists never have children. Think about that. Most atheists never have children. And the average atheist who does have children has 0.55 children. So, you know what I mean? Like we're saying atheists are not, if all America was atheists, our population would decline rapidly tomorrow. And I know that's part of this conversation. Nothing in particular is have more kids than atheists, but not as much as like Protestants or Catholics or Latter-day Saints. Latter-day Saints are the most. I know you guys are all shocked by that, right? They have the largest families. The average Latter-day Saint family has 2.6 children, when for Protestants it's about 2.0. For atheists, it's 1. So they're not even replacing the two parents. They're not replacing them either. So for nothing in particular, I think a lot of them go, we don't want to have kids because economically we can't, you know what I mean, we can't deal with children at this point. And plus with their job situation being so tenuous and not having a steady career, I think that leads them to making kind of a rational decision by not having more children. I will say this, interestingly enough, even today in America, 85% of people are still raised in a religious household, okay? If you look at the people born between 1995 and 2000, so these are people like young adults, say Gen Z, the oldest members of Gen Z, 15% say they were raised without religion, but 30% of them have no religion by their 25th birthday. So they're slipping away from religion. I have a book coming out with 2 pastors. It's coming out in August called The Great De-Churching. And we did 3 surveys of people who used to go to church at least once a month or more and now go seldom or never. And so we try to figure out what are the causes of all those things, right? Like, why are you not going to church? You know what the answer is not? It's not theology. It's not theology. And that's what pastors don't like us to sell. Like if you ask them, like, what do you believe about Jesus and resurrection and forgiveness and all the Christian doctrines, they are overwhelmingly agreeing with basic Christian Orthodox doctrine. It is not that they still believe in that stuff. It's the other stuff they're getting rid of. And I think that's we ask them, my favorite question is we ask them, when were you the most religious in your life? Like pick an age, right? When you're the most religious. The plurality of people chose before the age of 15. Like 45% of people chose before the age of 15. So something is happening, right? In that 15 to 25-year-old window, which is sort of a black box, I think. And for like atheist agnostics, you know what they're doing in that 15 to 25 window? They're going to college and probably going to grad school and kind of going on to these higher level careers with nothing in particulars. They're going to high school and stopping and going to work at Home Depot, or some other, low level job. And I think that's where that, the forks in the road happen in that 15 to 25-year-old range. And I'd like to do a lot more work of trying to figure out like how religion plays into that or kind of stops that or accelerates certain things.
Just to build on that, one thing that we were talking about is like, for a lot of those people, thinking about religion is in some degrees like a privilege.
Yes.
Or like to have like time to sit and think like, what do I believe and why?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it sounds like the Latino church sort of is a piece of this, but like churches used to be a place where it's like, you don't have to think as much about theology, it's just like it's a place that might offer you a warm meal, or it's like a place you turn to for social services.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fading in white churches? It sounds like it's sort of rallying in Latino churches, but I'm curious what role that plays.
I'll give you a stat. The most likely group to go to church, house of worship today in America are people with 4-year college degrees making between $60,000 and $100,000 a year. That is if you look at like the curve, so you put income here, the curve it's curvilinear. It gets high in the middle and low on the ends. So the very low income or less, the very high income or less. It's like the middle class, like the people who did things right. What I mean by right is went to college, got married, had kids, didn't get divorced. You know what I'm saying here, right? The white picket fence thing. And the problem is nothing in particulars. I don't. So here's a story. I went to a liturgical church in college. We did prayers of the people. You guys know what that is? Where you'll do a little prayer time, but the pastor will do like a little rote prayer, and then you'll say, does anyone in the congregation have someone to pray for? And someone will go, oh, my sister has breast cancer. We all pray for her. And then the pastor says, Lord, in your mercy, and we all say, hear our prayer. And you do like 3 or 4 of these. It's like a way to, talk to the community. I was at this little church. We did that. And there was this guy who walked in the back. He was younger than me, probably 20 years old. He had his girlfriend or his wife there. They had a little baby. Okay. At the end of prayers for the people, he speaks up and goes, could you all pray for me? I lost my job and I don't know how I'm going to pay the rent. And we said, Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Service, went as services go. Service is over. What I saw was one of the older gentlemen in the congregation who owned a local business went straight to that young man and said, son, if you need a job, I can get you a job tomorrow at my lumber yard. You know what I mean? Like if we're talking about like what nothing in particulars need, they need to speak their need. They need a community to speak the need into. And you know what church people love to do? Help church people. Like, honest to God, like I grew up in a very poor household, and what got us through was boxes of food on our front porch when my dad lost his job. And I think probably one of the reasons I'm still religious is because of that. You know what I mean? People who took care of my family. And so I think that like I don't want to blame anyone for their poverty. So don't hear me wrong here. But if nothing in particular has got engaged in some sort of social community, I think they could have a higher chance of moving up the economic spectrum because they get that first rung of the ladder to a better career or a better job or a better training or something that could get them out of this sort of endless grind of working, dead-end jobs. So
I can respond to that too. I think with respect to the Latino church, yeah, we sort of just like reflexively care for each other, right? It's like some doesn't have a job, they don't have food, they need a lawyer. I think also the Brown Church is like, it's a repository of many different types of community cultural wealth. So it's where we learn linguistic skills, it's where we learn leadership, it's where we care for each other, right? It's where we celebrate the holidays together. So it's where many of us get our start. And so I think that it's not just like an individualistic, like, okay, I'm gonna go to church so I can hear the sermon, but it's like, I'm here and we're gonna survive together. It's where our parents, maybe they work, difficult immigrant jobs that nobody wants to do during the week, but then during the weekend, they're pastor or their sister or their deacon, right? So it's a community.
Will, Ron, did you have a question?
I think it was pretty much covered by Eugene's question earlier, but Ryan, I was wondering.
You hit that little button too.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
I was wondering, Ryan, when if we have this data, when you put a survey out in the field where the option for none isn't there, or the option for agnostic isn't there, how do they identify, and do they identify differently when you take away their preferred bucket?
I actually published a peer-reviewed article about this question. So the General Social Survey has been going on since 1972. It only gave you one option for none. Like no religion was the option. If you compare that number to like the cooperative election study that gave you 3 options, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, it was a lot lower in the General Social Survey compared to the cooperative election study because they only gave you 1 option versus 3. So definitely, if you look at the share, like if you look in my new book, plug, that just came out, I looked at 6 different surveys and the share of nones in each of those. Gallup puts it at 21 and the cooperative election study puts it at 36. And it's all based on how many options you give people, but also how you ask the question, but also what survey method you use. So if you do a face-to-face survey, you're going to get
that jump from 31 to 36 was what category?
21 to 36.
21 to 36 was what category though?
The share of people who identify as no religion.
Okay.
So it can be. I tell people it's 30 because Pew puts it at 29, and I think they actually do a really good job of like trying to sort all this stuff out. But what we know is if you ask someone face-to-face if you're religious or not, they're much more likely to say yes than if you ask it like on a browser, like a web design. So that's why almost all surveys now are going to web because A, they're cheaper, and I think actually when it comes to religion questions, they're actually better because you will give the honest answer there, not the socially desirable answer. And that's also one of the other benefits is it's brought the cost of surveys way down. Because to do a phone survey is insanely expensive. To do what you can do right now, you can do a 1,000-person general population survey for less than $5,000, which is not, in survey land, that is dirt cheap. You can get a grant for $5,000 relatively easy. So that's what when I talk about the golden age of survey data, that's why, is because it's so much cheaper now than it used to be to do surveys. So a long-winded way to say how you ask the question is going to give you a way different answer. I also wrote a paper about, if you took atheists off, what would the atheists identify as? You know what they identified as? Nothing in particular or agnostic. So they picked the next closest thing and said, I'm that. They didn't say I'm Protestant or Catholic if you get rid of the atheist option. They kind of picked the closest answer to that option. So.
And is there a difference, between the two groups in terms of, okay, if I don't have the agnostic option, the agnostics tend towards atheist, whereas nons, if they don't have the non-option, would they choose Christian?
They would probably, yes. The share of non-attending Protestants and Catholics goes up when you don't give the nothing in particular option, because a lot of those people will say they're Protestant or Catholic because they don't want to say they're atheist agnostic. So they'll say, crap, I'm a Protestant, but I never go to church. You know what I mean? So it's like the least bad option for them is a non-attending Protestant or Catholic. Yeah.
For the Latino, situation, I think a lot of people who identify as in the none, they still are Christian. They just think that term Christian has all this bad stuff associated with it, like nationalism and stuff. But if you ask them, they're like, oh yeah, I want to get married in the church and I want to baptize my kid and all those kinds of things. Yeah.
All right, we got 2 more. We got Hal Boyd and let's do it. Yair. Person. From the Atlantic.
So you mentioned that this is the golden age of survey data, and in part because you can reach people who will give you more honest answers on the internet. But from what I've seen in the questions we have about our polling today and national politics, the concern is that these online surveys don't reach, and in general, surveys in general no longer reach the most disconnected in society, the people who might be most likely to identify as nones. So do you worry that in fact we're undercounting?
Yes, the answer, yeah. So Trump ruined surveys, to be dead honest with you, because he put so much skepticism in people's hearts about polls because of 2016. So now what we see is Republicans especially will not respond to surveys. Now there's ways to fix that, we'll pay you. You know what I mean? And so what we do now, I use what are called panel surveys, which is where, we use a survey firm called Qualtrics, which what they do is they already have a stable of people and they just send a little, do this survey for $3. And that's how they can do it so cheaply. And what's really nice about them is say, we want to do only a survey of black women over the age of 65. They've got 1,000 in their database they can just pull straight from. So that's, I think that's one way. And I think they spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get those those edge cases into the fold, how much financially they have to compensate them more. And they, so listen, here's where I land on surveys right now. I say, are they perfect? No. Are they good? Sometimes no. But I go, what's the alternative we have? You know what I mean? Imagine a world where we could not do surveys. It was against the law to do a survey. How much would you know on election day of who's going to win? You have a Dewey defeats Truman situation every single election season, especially how close elections are now at the national level. So I think they've gotten, the 2022 polls are actually really good. The 2020 were not very good. And we've got to figure out how to be more consistently good over time. And I think if Trump goes away, I think our polls will get better after that. So.
The survey maker's case against Donald Trump.
Listen, I will be completely self-interested and said, I hope Trump goes away for that reason alone.
Hal Boyd.
It's a great Atlantic piece right there.
Yeah.
I just had a brief question. Well, first, you said, Latter-day Saints have 2.6 kids. As a Latter-day Saint with 4 kids, I resent that low estimate.
It's got to be 7.6.
If I'm gonna do the work for 4, give me credit for 4. The question I had was, do you have any sense for how the United States compares relative to other countries? What do we look like demographically from a religious standpoint? Are we more like Mexico? Are we more like, France? I know that's not correct. But if you have any sense, I'd be interested.
Yeah, so in the nuns, actually the reason I know this, I just did the graph. I have Western Europe. Western Europe's the one I can tell you right now at the top of my head. So about 25% of Americans go to church, houses of worship every week in America. Okay, so that's the baseline. The national average in Western Europe is 14%. Actually, Eastern and Western Europe is 14% on the European continent. Poland is a really interesting country. 44% of Poles go to church every week, which is almost double the American average, which is crazy because their neighbors, like in the Eastern Bloc, are in the single digits. Like they're 12, 14, and Poland's 44%. The one that looks the most like us in Western Europe is Italy. They're about 25% too. The ones we don't look like a lot are Germany, France, they're both like 8 or 9%. We really don't look like Scandinavia though, which is like 5, 4, 3%. Iceland, Norway, Sweden, those are the least religious countries on earth. The Scandinavian countries are the least religious. I did a scatter plot in the latest Nuns where I put GDP on one axis and the shares say religion's very important on the other axis. And it's obviously a negative relationship, right? So the more economically advanced you are, the less religious you are. We have basically the same GDP as Sweden, okay? Right about the same. About 12% of Swedes say religion's very important. In America, it's 51%. So that just shows you like how weird we are compared to what we should be. I mean, we are, and that's why no one ever invites me to leave this country to go do talks like this, because whatever you learn about American religion does not transfer anywhere else in the world. We are an odd duck when it comes to religion.
So what do you attribute that to?
A couple things. One is we never had a state church in America, which is one of the best things we ever did. The Jeffersonian fights over this were some of the most important fights that we had. Because if you want to make people hate something really a lot, make it part of the government. Like in Germany still has a state religion. You have to pay taxes to the state church in Germany unless you opt out. And that they don't they don't want to be forced into doing that. So that did two things. One, it made us not hate religion, which is, probably a good starting point. Secondly, it also forced American religion to be more entrepreneurial and try harder. And this is an argument that, what's his name? Finke and Stark make in The Churching of America, which is a great book you all should read, where they basically argue that the earliest American religion was Congregationalist religion. Like Quakers and Congregationalists dominated America in the colonial period. But then around 1780 or around 1800, the Methodists and the Baptists came. And to be a Congregationalist pastor, you had to go to like divinity school. You had to have all this training and all this stuff. You know what they did to the Baptists and Methodists? They go, here's $50, there's a horse, go start a church. Don't come back. And you know what they did? Work their butts off to start some of the best churches in America. Because if your paycheck depends on you preaching well, you are going to preach well. And so that's what they argue, is that these Rough Riders basically went out west with no training And you know what? The ones who were bad went away, and the ones who were good stuck around and became some of those prominent Methodist and Baptist preachers in America. And if you look at the composition of American religion, it was all Congregationalists and Quakers. And then the Baptists and Methodists go boom and just shoot straight up in the early 1800s because they said no gatekeepers, no credentials, just go. It's almost like startup culture in Silicon Valley, right? Like, here's some money, go start a company, go do well. And most of them fail, but some succeed spectacularly. And because of that, we had competition and diversity. So even today, if you look at most counties in America, one tradition does not dominate. You know, there are many counties where you got Baptists and Methodists, or Baptists and Methodists and Catholics, or Episcopal. You know, there's always a nice mix. And when you're competing, that means you have to work harder to be better. And so what they would argue is this, it's called religious economy theory. It's like we're an economy, just like shoes or cell phones or anything else. And so when you work harder, you get diversity, and that means no religion in America ever dominated, which is good, but it also means that we always have a very robust religious marketplace.
But would we, were it not for immigrants?
Oh, right now, no, absolutely not.
Would we look more like Western Europe? But we are a country of immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And is that really?
I'll just kind of share a few thoughts with respect to the Latino church, just to give some relative numbers. So according to one study not too long ago, there were about 80% of Latinos identified as Christian, about 80%. There might be some more updated numbers, and about 18% unaffiliated. Well, most of those unaffiliated are also Christian of some type, right? There's 62.57 million Latinos. Okay, just so think about that, right? And we don't fit into those existing structures and systems of like ordination and of like seminary and all those kinds of things, where a lot of the traditional denominations, you have to get like an MDiv, which can take like 3 years full time, which is crazy, right? But in these churches where folks are thriving, you might have someone who's came to the U.S. from Mexico and has some training. But if they try to join the United Methodists, it's not going to work, right? Because they can't stop working 50 hours a week plus lead their church. And the vast majority of Latino pastors are bivocational, as an example. Another like way that this plays out is like you'll have like Latino pastors who are really the lead pastors of churches, but they're called like ministers or something, because they couldn't get the ordination in some fancy denomination, right? But the vast majority just say, well, screw it. Like, I love Jesus. I have this gifting. I'm going to take some classes at a seminary or local Bible institute and get my enough training. And that's where many churches are thriving. And so this is a whole other topic, but the face of theological education is in a major transition now. We could talk 2 hours just about that. But we don't fit because it didn't have us in mind.
That's good. Let's get one more from Dustin Gardner, San Francisco Chronicle.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on some of the questions about the data. I'm curious if you think there might be under-identification with people who are atheists. And I raised that question because, when I think about it just kind of from my own anecdotal observations, I think a lot of people who don't have religion, I don't think they're totally ambiguous about it. They just don't believe, but there is a stigma associated with being an atheist. Like, so, people can think it's dogmatic or kind of extreme. And so I'm curious if you think people might not select a label for that sort of a reason.
Thanks for teaming me up, Dustin. I've got a post on my Substack running on Thursday where I collect 4 different data points about why I think atheists are the most discriminated group in America today. Pew did a survey in 2014, asked, would you be happy, unhappy, or don't care if your close relative married someone of blank? And the blank was someone who doesn't believe in God. 49% of Americans said they'd be unhappy if their son or daughter married, which is the highest. White evangelicals got no leg to stand on there. It was like 12% of people would be unhappy if their kid married an evangelical. It was 49% would be unhappy if their kid married an atheist. If you do a feeling thermometer thing where you put these groups on a scale from 0 to 100, 0 meaning very cold, 100 being very warm, atheists score at the bottom amongst not just Republicans, but also Democrats too. The only group they scored lower was the Tea Party. This is in 2012. So there's all this data out there that says that atheists are easily the most stigmatized group in American society today. I think the answer 10 years ago would be maybe. I think the answer today is less so, because I think the internet's given you permission to be whatever you want to be. You know, and I write in the Nuns about, like, imagine you were an atheist born in Mississippi in 1960. You would live and die and never tell a single soul on earth that you were an atheist in Mississippi. And now you can go online and find an atheist in Mississippi Facebook group and a subreddit and a whole Instagram hashtag. And you know what that does? It makes you feel like you're not alone. And so when you're not alone, when the survey comes along, you know what you say, what you really are. So I think, are we there yet? No, but I think we're a heck of a lot closer to the real number than we've ever been before. And I think we might even, you know, I don't know what the holdouts are, but I don't think they're as big. I don't think there's twice as many atheists, let's say, in America than what say yes on surveys. It might be 20 or 30% more, but I don't think it's that, you know, it's probably not that high based on the destigmatization of going, especially with young people. Especially with college-educated white people, there's no stigma against being an atheist now, I don't feel like. Or very little, depending on where you live, obviously.
Did you say only 12% would be mad if their kid married?
Yeah, for white evangelical, yeah. If your kid was, yeah. Mm-hmm.
If your kid married...
If your kid married an evangelical, like, I could give you the number, it's really low. It's like 10, 12%. But for atheists, it's 49% overall. Of white evangelicals, 77% said they would be unhappy if their kid married an atheist.
Sure, right.
So there's a lot. But you know what's funny? It doesn't go the other direction. Atheists would be less unhappy if their kid married an evangelical. So it's like asymmetric intolerance. You know, it doesn't go both ways.
The reason I'm not surprised by that, this relates to Desmond's question, is we have to remember, especially 10 years ago, the most prominent atheists we knew in our society were really angry and mean.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so people's idea of what an atheist is, I remember when we were in Phoenix as reporters, I remember talking to someone who worked there. We both covered city government, and he was an atheist. And he said, I don't tell people, because if I tell people I'm an atheist, they think I kill babies. That's a very bad idea. But I'm not an atheist. Like I said, I'm an agnostic. But the stigma thing is real. I tell people all the time that coming out gay was easier than coming out as agnostic because we live in a country where when you say that there is no God, or I'm not sure that there's a God, people think you have no morals.
Yeah.
So
what was the line that Carolyn gave this morning? It was 85%. You know, still says that they believe in God. It was 91%. You know, like 12 years ago, if I recall. A lot of things are cascading, right? A couple speakers who have been through Faith Angle recently. Like, the late Peter Berger was, of course, one, and his whole line was that we're a nation of Indians ruled by Swedes. That is the most religious country on earth, but ruled by Swedes, like what Ryan was just saying. And therefore, that tension was a big part, honestly, about what kind of got Faith Angle started as a project, 24 years ago, is the idea that sort of most elites didn't realize just how religious the country was. And even for us in our own lifetimes, just, 23 years ago, 2000, 71.5% of people in the United States were members of a congregation. Members, not occasionally went, members. Now, just 2 decades, it's 49.5. I mean, the cascade of 21 points in 23 years is unbelievable in terms of measuring these things. This is the Gallup survey, right? That got so much attention about a year and a half ago. So we're in a time of transition, but the country's still pretty religious, kind of like what Carolyn was saying, I think earlier today. I have one parting. This whole talk about nothing in particular, it's very complicated. It seems like you're choosing something, but you don't choose. You're choosing nothing, and it calls to mind this old joke about Sartre's Cafe in Paris. The story is told of a couple who goes into a restaurant. They have a very nice meal. Afterwards, just like now, they outside the door order a coffee, and the husband says, "I'd like to have a coffee without cream," and the server says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We only serve milk at this cafe, and we have no milk. So I can only bring you a coffee without milk." And he has this sort of moment, like being in nothingness, right? It's the same thing, but I don't know, So this nothing in particular is complicated. All right, I feel like we ought to, unless you have a parting word.
9%, Eugene, that's the number. 9% of Americans have a problem, would be unhappy if their kid married a born-again Christian. So 9% versus 49%. That's it.
All right. Hey, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Ryan, very much.
Thanks,